Rob Yonan as he comes.
Good morning. A couple years ago, I did something uncharacteristic. Thanks, Kev. I read the instruction manual. So not me. I learned by doing and breaking it and then going to the manual. But I happened to notice in my garage, where I had all my power tools, some of the warnings on some of the instructions. I could not believe what I read. Basically, somebody did something stupid, and they put it in the manual. For instance, in the Craftsman 7.5-inch double insulated circular saw, there are 44 warnings. Number 1, know your power tools. Was there somebody who didn't? Secondly, keep children and visitors away. Oh, don't come to the garage. I have the circular saw out. Dress properly. Somebody didn't, and what was that like? Don't wear loose clothing or jewelry. So I'm gonna go cut lumber, hon. Mind if I put my pearls on? Don't abuse the cord. Okay. On the lawnmower, this was written for the mafia. Clear the area of objects such as rocks, toys, wires, sticks, and bones. What? Mow only in daylight. Now, really? Somebody walking around with a flashlight mowing there? The leaf blower vac. Somebody did something so stupid they had to put this in there. Do not pick up anything that is burning or smoking, such as cigarettes, matches, or hot ashes. Can you imagine the leaf vacuum and what that would do? Do not pick up flammable or combustible liquids, such as gasoline. I want to meet the person who did that. You made it in the manual. And lastly, the snow thrower. It was a 25-year-old snowblower someone gave us. Do not operate equipment without wearing adequate winter outer garments. Okay. Never operate without good visibility or light. They improved on the don't do it at night. Do not carry passengers on the snowblower. And they took all the fun out of blowing snow when they put this one in. Never direct snow at bystanders. Well, it's all that stuff is in there and all those manuals. Somebody had to do something stupid, which is why they put them in there. Somebody tried a shortcut, but really the manuals were there for everybody's protection. In a similar manner, I know it may be a stretch, but we're going to find out how Jesus' interactions with his disciples served as a sort of manual of sorts, putting it all out there so they'd know what to do. Now, I'm going to pretty much use Luke 24. A lot of it will be on the screen. You could follow that way, or in the Bible in the seat back, or on the app, whatever way. But when we get to Luke 24, here's the setting. Jesus had been killed. It'd been a couple days. No miracle stopped it from happening. And so the next day was desperation and fear, because if they could do this to him, they could do this to us. That's what the disciples are thinking. Early in the morning, on what we call Sunday morning, which was the second day after, some of the women go to the tomb to do some of the regular things they would do after a burial. They're shocked, they're confused, and they're also afraid, but Jesus appears to them and tells them to run back and tell the others. So they do go back to tell the others, and when they do, Peter and John bolt for the tomb, and they find it empty. That's the setting. When we pick up the story in Luke 24, we find this in verse 13. That same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things, Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them, but God kept them from recognizing him. So I don't know where 7 miles from here, how far south would you get on Oleo? That's kind of the terrain. In fact, if you look at the geographical map, which is, again, if you get to go to Israel, it's amazing because everything comes alive. You actually notice the further south you go from Jerusalem, the more arid it gets. And the further inland you go, further north, and then further west toward the Mediterranean, you get more greenery. And so you get a path maybe like that. Sometimes it's a little bit more open, but whatever that path to Emmaus was, it was a 7-mile walk, and people walked all the time back then. Again, you notice there it's a little bit more open. So these guys are walking that way, and somehow they don't recognize Jesus. They're discouraged. They're absolutely disillusioned. And I would imagine they're engrossed in conversation with one another. And because it's after the Passover, this national yearly holiday, many people were probably on that road leaving for the weekend. And so it would not have been hard for people to come and go, I would imagine. And so Jesus asks them this question: what are you discussing together as you're walking along? His first question, I believe, is an invitation from them for conversation. They stood still and their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, who we never read about again, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened here these days?" Like, where have you been hiding? I mean, you haven't heard? Everybody in the area knows what just happened this weekend. And Jesus asks one of the best questions of all. What things? Of all the people who knew the answer to that question, he asks what things? About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one. That's my favorite line. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, and they didn't find his body. Now, can you imagine how messed up that was for them? They came and they told us they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it as the woman said, but him they did not see. I mean, he was awesome. Everything he said was brilliant and life-giving. I'm imagining them saying this, backed up with incredible, miraculous powers. His way of living was so contradictory to so many of the religious leaders. He became a threat to them, which is why he killed them. And that's what we don't get. All that power, all that brilliant teaching, it all pointed to him being the Messiah we have been waiting for. And now he's gone. How on earth could this have happened? And as if that's not bad enough, the women tell us that the body's gone. And then they said they saw angels who said they saw him alive. And a couple of our friends said the tomb is absolutely empty. It's all so confusing and discouraging. What on earth is going on? Then Jesus said to them, "How foolish you are and slow of heart to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scriptures concerning himself. So they continue walking, and Jesus goes back through the scriptures and shows them one spot after another where the prophetic statements there were speaking about what was to come. He didn't pull punches when he said this, which I find interesting. And even as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, what amazes me is what amazes Jesus. They didn't need to be surprised he was telling them. They should have known. They could have known. And not only was it foretold in the scriptures, but he'd been telling them all along. It was all there for them in the instruction manuals, as it were, for them to see. The crazy part is that during this part of the conversation, they're still not recognizing him. For whatever reason, they don't realize who they're walking with. As they approach the village to where they're going, Jesus acted as if he was going farther. But they urged him strongly, that Middle Eastern hospitality. "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. I love this moment, because he makes it seem like he's going beyond the city of Emmaus. Why? I wonder if it's simply because he wants to give them the opportunity to keep the conversation going. And I think it is much like Jesus today. wanting to know if we want him around. He didn't force them, and he doesn't force us. So they invite him to join them, and we find them at the dinner table somewhere in Emmaus. And we read this: when he was at the table with them, he took bread, sound familiar? Gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to him. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from sight. That must have been something alone. So they ask each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? So they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. So they walked the 7 miles, and now they turn around, and they want to go back 7 miles to catch up with everybody and tell them what they just experienced. And what do they find? They're all hiding because, again, they're afraid that they may get persecuted like Jesus was, and they're all in shock as well. So then they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and said, it's true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon Peter. Then the two told what happened on the way, how Jesus recognized by them how he was recognized by them when he broke the bread, which we'll do later this morning. And while they were talking about this, Jesus himself came and stood among them. Peace be with you. As I would be, they were startled and afraid. I'd be freaked out. Thinking they saw a ghost, he said to them, again, one of those classic questions from Jesus, why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It's I, myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. And when he said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. And while they still didn't believe it because of their own joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything to eat? So they gave him a piece of broiled fish. And he took it and ate it in their presence and said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, what we would consider the first 5 books of the Old Testament primarily, the prophets and the Psalms. And then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. So once again, he takes them back to the scriptures. Once again, he's baffled by their lack of faith. They didn't need to be surprised or devastated. He's been telling them about it all along so that they would remember it, so that in the heat of the moment, they would not lose their faith at all. There was never any fine print. It was all right there, like those instruction manuals, to inform and to warn them. And he said it over and over again. For instance, very early in his ministry, he's standing in front of the temple in Jerusalem, and he says this, go ahead and tear down this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now, he was speaking metaphorically, which he did a number of times. And when you stand next to him, this is actually a picture of underneath the temple now. Those are some of the original foundation stones. It is incredible to stand there. It's hard to describe. But can you imagine him standing in front of this ginormous structure that even the way the stone is made and how well it's cut, and say, go ahead and tear this down in 3 days? And again, he's speaking metaphorically. But what do we find out this? When Jesus said this temple, he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he said, and they both believed both the scriptures and what Jesus said. The point is, the disciples didn't catch it at the moment. I mean, who would? It wasn't an obvious description of what was going to happen. In fact, there were over a dozen occasions when Jesus warns them, often using metaphors like this, that were missed in the moment but caught later. But there were 3 that were different that are recorded for us. The first one comes about a year before his crucifixion and actually signals a shift in how he speaks about what's coming. And we find this both in Matthew and Mark. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but on the third day, he would be raised from the dead. As he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. I mean, that messes with them. And so Peter, the outspoken representative, pulls him aside like, no way, this can't happen. You're the one we've been waiting for. Look at all the good you're doing. Look at the miracles and the way people are responding. This can't be happening. In that moment, Jesus scolds him and says, you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. My way is different. It'll be hard, but it'll also be incredible. The reality of what Jesus is saying, even clearly in that moment, just doesn't sink in. Not yet, and I don't know how it could. They'd yet to see anybody tortured, killed, and then raised from the dead. But later on, in another city, Jesus tells them again, very clearly. After they gathered again in Galilee, Jesus told them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed. But on the third day, he will be raised from the dead. And the disciples were filled with grief. Again, it's not sinking in. The thought of this even happening is mind-blowing to them. They're struggling to understand what it means. It's bizarre. It's confusing. In fact, so much so that Matthew records that they were even afraid to ask him, so they don't even ask him anymore about it. But the third time Jesus says to them very plainly is when they're on their way to Jerusalem, where this all was going to take place, exactly like he said, and actually in just a few days. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed by the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. We are going. They will torture and kill me, but I will rise from the dead. Time after time, he told them what was going to happen, including multiple times and in various ways, even at the Last Supper, which is primarily recorded in John 13 to 17. But they still couldn't put all the pieces together yet. It still didn't come really to clarity until after his resurrection. But for example, he said it in these ways. I tell you this beforehand, so that when it happens, you will believe that I am the Messiah. I am leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled or afraid. And one last thing he says to them just before what we see is his last prayer recorded in John 17. I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world. In this world, you will have sorrows and trials and sorrows. It shouldn't surprise you of all people, because this world is broken and will remain broken as long as people continue to reject me. It is why this world needs a Savior. It's why I've come, and I'm telling you now so you're not caught off guard. But take heart, because I have overcome this world. Let this sink in. Trust me. Listen. My repeated warnings ahead of time will come true, and they will let you know that I can be trusted. My resurrection will tell you that I have overcome and let you know that you can have faith, courage, and even peace in the face of death. My paraphrase, I've been telling you over and over again, and I'm telling you again now, before it all comes down, so when the difficult days come, you won't lose your faith. You'll trust me and my ways and experience peace like none other. So don't be afraid. If they remember and believe, it will sustain them in the darkest hours they will ever experience. some of which are coming just within hours of Jesus saying this. There at that dinner gathering, the disciples are still trying to figure things out. They were timid, afraid, confused, unsure, and actually in a few hours they would desert Jesus. But after his resurrection, they would be changed forever. They would face persecution and death with an otherworldly courage and peace he's been modeling and offering from the beginning for them and for us. It's what he wanted them to have. It's what he offers for us to have as well. In a world filled with trouble, Jesus offers peace instead of fear when we take to heart what Jesus said. It was a 7-mile walk. There were so many questions and so much pain. They couldn't believe what was happening. Why us? They would cry out to God. What are we going to do now? Then he comes along and asks a few simple questions, and everything pours out. And he listens, and he listens, and he listens. And then it's his turn. He takes time to show them, to clarify for them what he and the scriptures have been saying all along. Their eyes are opened and their lives are changed. In this world, we will have trials and sorrow. No escaping it. Even what Kevin just shared before we prayed is evidence of it in the last week. That won't change on this side of eternity. Thankfully, Jesus didn't stop there, because he said, take heart, because he has overcome and he will help us do the same. Are you on a 7-mile walk away from Jerusalem, disillusioned with God, confused, frustrated, weary? I imagine Jesus coming up alongside you, almost without you noticing, and asking you a simple question. What happened? What's going on? Tell me, let's talk. He had such high hopes, we thought he was the one. Their question revealed disillusionment and despair. But his questions invite them out of that despair and into confidence and peace. We're going to celebrate communion with this backdrop when he breaks bread and their eyes are opened. And Kevin will come to lead us in a moment. But before we get there, we want to give you time, as we had each other week, to imagine that you are walking south on Oleo Road. You got 7 miles to go wherever you're going, and it's just you, and he comes alongside you and says, what's going on? What happened? And you got 7 miles to talk about it. What would you tell him?
Friends, we're going to enter into a time of communion. And if you need the elements, if you didn't pick them up on your way in, if you came in one of the side doors and you need them, raise your hand, and we've got ushers that'll make sure that you are able to receive them. I wonder how many times they sat with Jesus and broke bread. It was something that I'm sure they had done hundreds and hundreds of times. But there was something different about this time. There were two things that they realized. First of all, it was Passover, which was a special national celebration that they gathered. It was a celebration of their escape from Egypt when they had been enslaved there and their movement towards freedom in the Promised Land. And so that was a special meal, a special gathering. But Jesus had also done something that had surprised them as they started the meal. He took on the posture of a servant. He went around and he washed their dirty, tired feet, tired from the long journey, something that a servant typically did. And Jesus is preparing them. He's trying to get their attention because he's about to share with them many things that he wants them to know, because as Rob said, they weren't fully aware of what was coming. And so he takes these ordinary elements, the bread and the wine, and he puts new significance in them. And so he took the bread and he passed it among them. It wasn't a big fluffy loaf because of the way they celebrated Passover. They baked bread without yeast, and so it was probably more like a pita bread. And he broke it and he passed it among his disciples. And he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then later in this meal, he took the cup and he said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." And Jesus invites us as his followers to celebrate that. He invites us, and it's been something that the church has celebrated throughout the centuries. And we're reminded in 1 Corinthians 11, he says, "For every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you are announcing the Lord's death until he comes again." See, communion looks back to Jesus' death and resurrection and the sacrifice he made on our behalf, but it also looks forward to the hope that he gives us, that one day he'll return and restore all things. So friends, we're going to do what the church has done for thousands of years. We're going to participate in communion together. Now, 1 Corinthians 11 also reminds us that when we take communion, that we should spend some time reflecting. And so we encourage you to just spend a few moments just reflecting. Maybe there's something that you need to confess. Maybe there's something that you just need to surrender to him. The worship team is going to play quietly, and then they're going to lead us in some worship. But you respond however you need to in this moment.